The map room was unusually quiet on the morning of July 18, 1944. Outside, the fighting in Normandy had already turned fields into mud, smoke, and broken steel. Inside a German headquarters near St. L, a wooden table was covered with captured American equipment: rifles, field maps, a torn jacket, a pair of muddy boots. Then one officer placed an American steel helmet in the center of the table. Every eye turned toward it.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
It looked ordinary at first, but painted across the front was a bold white bar. Another helmet carried a strange vertical stripe. A third had a small playing card symbol. The room fell silent. German officers had studied enemy weapons for years. They understood tanks, artillery, radios, and uniforms. But these simple marks made no immediate sense. Were they secret codes, unit signals, command symbols, or were they hiding something much bigger? What began as a simple inspection soon became a puzzle that even experienced intelligence officers struggled to solve. For weeks, reports from the front had mentioned unusual markings on American helmets. Different divisions seemed to use different systems. Some soldiers carried bold stripes across the back of the helmet. Others wore painted bars on the front. Airborne troops sometimes carried symbols that looked completely different from those of regular infantry. The reports often contradicted one another. One patrol claimed the marks identified officers. Another believed they showed squad leaders. A third insisted they marked assault teams. None of the reports matched perfectly. That uncertainty frustrated German intelligence, because confusion on the battlefield usually meant someone else held the advantage. By the summer of 1944, the German army had become very good at reading small details. Years of war had taught officers that victories often came from information rather than firepower alone. They studied tire tracks to estimate the number of vehicles. They counted radio signals to locate headquarters. They examined ration cans to identify supply routes. Even cigarette brands found in abandoned foxholes could reveal which Allied nation had recently occupied an area. Nothing was considered too small to matter. That is why the painted marks on American helmets received serious attention instead of being ignored as decoration. The first large collection of American helmets arrived after the heavy fighting around Carrington. Several belonged to infantry units. Others came from airborne soldiers who had jumped into Normandy during the early hours of June 6. Each helmet seemed to tell a different story. Some carried white rectangles. Others displayed horizontal stripes. A few showed faint painted symbols that had almost disappeared beneath dust and rain. German officers carefully arranged them side by side, hoping a pattern would appear. Instead, the collection created even more questions. Many German commanders believed the Americans depended heavily on organization. Compared with German doctrine, American forces often appeared to place greater emphasis on logistics, communication, and coordination. Trucks reached the front with surprising speed. Replacement troops arrived quickly. Artillery answered calls in minutes. If the helmet markings were connected to this system, understanding them might reveal how American units operated under pressure. Colonel Eberhard von der Heide, who had extensive experience observing Allied airborne operations, warned fellow officers against making quick conclusions. He understood that American forces often adapted their methods depending on the mission. Something that meant one thing in Sicily could mean something entirely different in Normandy. His caution proved important because many of the captured helmets came from completely different divisions that had never fought together before. Meanwhile, American soldiers rarely thought about the confusion they were causing. Most were focused on surviving another day. Their helmets collected scratches from tree branches, dents from falling debris, and mud from endless marches across the Norman countryside. To many young GIs, the painted marks were simply another part of daily life. Few imagined enemy intelligence officers were studying every brushstroke as though it were a military secret. To understand why these markings appeared at all, the story had begun years before the first Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. In training camps across the United States during 1942 and 1943, officers searched for better ways to recognize leaders during fast-moving exercises. Modern battlefields were loud and chaotic. Smoke covered entire fields. Radios sometimes failed. Men became separated from their squads within minutes. In that confusion, finding the right leader quickly could mean the difference between holding a position or losing it. One solution seemed simple. Paint clear markings on helmets so soldiers could immediately identify important personnel. During training, many units experimented with white bars, rectangles, stripes, and other symbols. The exact design depended on the division. There was no single army-wide rule covering every marking. Different commanders adopted systems that worked best for their own units. Some infantry divisions painted a vertical white stripe on the back of officers' helmets so troops following behind could locate them during movement. Other units used horizontal bars or geometric shapes for non-commissioned officers leading squads. Military police often wore highly visible markings because directing traffic during major operations required them to be recognized instantly. Shore parties, engineers, and other specialists also developed distinctive helmet markings when their duties demanded quick identification. These practical solutions worked well during stateside exercises. Soldiers crossing obstacle courses or conducting mock assaults could instantly recognize the men responsible for giving orders. Training became smoother. Units moved faster. Problems were corrected more quickly. The system appeared successful enough that many formations carried the idea overseas. But combat was nothing like training. The first major warning appeared during the fighting in North Africa. Experienced veterans noticed something dangerous. Enemy snipers were patient observers. They watched carefully before taking a shot. A clearly marked helmet sometimes attracted unwanted attention. Instead of helping a leader survive, the paint could identify him as someone worth eliminating first. Several officers quietly removed or covered their markings before entering active combat. The lesson became even clearer during the campaign in Sicily in July 1943. American airborne units suffered heavy confusion during night operations. Darkness, scattered landings, and friendly fire created chaos. Helmet markings helped soldiers recognize one another in some situations. But visibility worked both ways. If friendly troops could see the markings, so could the enemy whenever light conditions allowed. Commanders now faced a difficult balance between identification and survival. Back in Europe, German intelligence remained unaware of many of these internal debates. They continued assuming every marking must serve a fixed operational purpose. Captured documents offered few answers because helmet markings were usually local decisions rather than formal doctrine. This only deepened the mystery. Why would different divisions use different systems if they all belonged to the same army? As July progressed, another report arrived from the front. German troops fighting west of St. L claimed they had encountered American soldiers wearing helmets marked with white playing card symbols. One carried a spade. Another appeared to display a heart. At first glance, the report sounded unbelievable. Some officers dismissed it as battlefield imagination. Yet within days, another captured helmet confirmed the observation. This discovery produced fresh speculation. Perhaps each symbol represented an armored regiment. Perhaps they identified assault companies preparing for major attacks. Others believed the cards formed part of an elaborate deception plan designed to confuse enemy intelligence. The truth, however, was far simpler and far more interesting than anyone inside that headquarters expected. Several American armored divisions had begun using playing card symbols as quick visual identifiers for battalions. A spade, heart, club, or diamond painted on vehicles and sometimes on helmets allowed soldiers to recognize their own battalion more easily during fast-moving armored operations. It was practical, not secret. Yet because the practice was not universal across the army, German officers struggled to fit it into a single logical system. That misunderstanding revealed something important about the American way of war. Unlike armies that relied on rigid uniformity, many U.S. formations enjoyed considerable freedom in solving practical problems. Commanders often adapted methods to local conditions. One division painted helmet markings. Another abandoned them. A third modified them halfway through the campaign after gaining combat experience. To German analysts searching for one master code, this flexibility looked almost impossible to decode. The deeper they investigated, the stranger the evidence became. Fresh helmets captured from the newly arrived U.S. 29th Infantry Division showed different patterns from those collected after airborne fighting. Equipment recovered near hedgerow battles south of Bayou differed again. Every answer created another contradiction. The officers began to wonder whether they had misunderstood the Americans from the beginning. Perhaps the paint itself was never the real story. Perhaps the true secret lay in the freedom each unit had to adapt, improvise, and change without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. They did not yet realize that the most surprising discovery was still waiting for them. Before the summer ended, captured prisoners, battlefield observations, and one unexpected firefight would force German officers to completely rethink everything they believed about those mysterious marks on American helmets. The answer began to emerge during the final weeks of July 1944 as American forces prepared for Operation Cobra. German reconnaissance units reported unusual activity behind the Allied lines. Fresh troops moved into assembly areas. Tanks disappeared beneath camouflage nets. Engineers quietly widened roads and strengthened bridges. Through binoculars, German observers noticed something unexpected. Many American helmets that had once carried bright markings now looked plain. Some still showed faint traces of white paint, but others had been completely covered with mud, fresh olive drab paint, or strips of camouflage netting. It was the first clear sign that the Americans themselves had changed the way they used the markings. German intelligence officers compared new battlefield reports with the helmets they had collected earlier. The differences were impossible to ignore. The marks were not permanent. They appeared during one operation and disappeared before the next. That discovery challenged nearly every theory developed during the previous weeks. Secret military codes were not usually painted over before a major offensive. Something else was happening. The explanation came from several captured American soldiers questioned after heavy fighting near St. L. They described the markings in simple terms. Some had been ordered to paint them before an operation. Others had been told to remove them before entering dangerous combat zones. The decision depended entirely on the commander and the mission. If quick recognition was more important than concealment, the markings stayed. If enemy snipers posed a greater threat, they disappeared. It was a practical battlefield decision, not an unbreakable military rule. For German officers raised in a system that valued strict standardization, this flexibility was difficult to understand. They expected every division to follow the same manual. Instead, they found an army that encouraged adaptation. One regiment solved a problem one way. Another solved it differently. Both methods could be correct if they matched the battlefield. That freedom made American units much harder to predict than German analysts had expected. The confusion became even greater when they examined helmets belonging to the American airborne divisions. During the night before D-Day on June 6, 1944, thousands of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had jumped into darkness over Normandy. Many helmets carried painted insignia, tactical symbols, or strips of tape applied shortly before takeoff. Some markings helped soldiers recognize one another after scattered landings. Others identified stick numbers or unit organization before boarding aircraft. Yet after landing, many paratroopers removed or covered those same markings because survival depended on remaining as difficult to identify as possible. Imagine standing in a dark Norman hedgerow before sunrise. Gunfire echoes through the fields. The air smells of wet earth, smoke, and burned powder. Every shadow could hide a friendly soldier or an enemy patrol. In those moments, even a small marking on a helmet could help someone recognize a familiar face. Minutes later, the same marking could draw the attention of a German sniper hidden hundreds of meters away. The value of the paint changed almost from hour to hour. Veterans understood this better than anyone. Experienced non-commissioned officers often told replacements that surviving in combat meant knowing when to be seen and when to disappear. A helmet marking was simply another tool. Like a flashlight, it was useful under the right conditions and dangerous under the wrong ones. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France, German reports became increasingly inconsistent. One battle described clearly marked helmets leading road traffic through liberated towns. Another reported entire American battalions with no visible markings at all. Intelligence officers eventually reached an important conclusion. The Americans were not following one system because they did not need one. Their strength came from combining standard training with local initiative. This realization matched other observations already coming from the front. American artillery units responded with remarkable speed because communication networks were strong. Supply columns kept advancing even after roads were damaged because engineers quickly created new routes. Medical teams evacuated wounded soldiers efficiently because every unit understood its responsibilities. None of those strengths depended on one painted stripe or one white bar. The helmet markings simply reflected a larger culture of practical problem-solving. There was another detail that German officers slowly came to appreciate. American leaders were expected to remain close to their men. Platoon leaders, company commanders, and senior non-commissioned officers often moved near the front instead of directing battles from far behind the lines. During training, visible helmet markings helped younger soldiers locate those leaders. In combat, experienced officers accepted that the situation might require different choices. Leadership was not defined by paint. It was defined by judgment. Even within the same division, practices changed as the war continued. Veterans shared lessons after every campaign. What worked in North Africa did not always work in Italy. What succeeded in Italy sometimes failed in Normandy. By the winter fighting in the Ardennes during December 1944, many frontline units had become much more cautious about anything that made soldiers easier to identify. Camouflage became increasingly important as both sides learned from years of brutal combat. The famous M1 steel helmet itself also deserves attention because it became one of the defining symbols of the American soldier. Introduced in 1941, it replaced older designs with a stronger shape that provided better protection against shell fragments. Its separate liner made it practical for daily use, while its wide rim offered improved coverage. Millions were produced during the war. Every dent, scratch, and faded patch of paint told the story of someone who had marched through rain, crawled across fields, or survived exploding artillery. The markings painted on those helmets were temporary. The helmet itself became a lasting symbol of endurance. After the liberation of Paris in August 1944 and the rapid Allied advance across France, German intelligence had far greater concerns than decoding helmet paint. Fuel shortages, constant air attacks, and collapsing defensive lines demanded immediate attention. The mystery that had occupied officers only weeks earlier quietly faded into the background. Yet the lesson remained. Following the war, historians examining captured German intelligence records discovered just how much effort had been spent studying seemingly ordinary pieces of American equipment. The reports showed remarkable attention to detail. German analysts were intelligent professionals doing exactly what their jobs required. They searched for hidden meaning because hidden meaning often existed in wartime. In this case, however, the greatest surprise was that there was no single secret waiting to be uncovered. The painted marks had never been part of one massive coded system. They represented something less dramatic but far more revealing. They reflected an army willing to experiment, adapt, and learn. A commander facing one problem could develop a practical solution without waiting for every other unit to do the same. That approach sometimes created confusion, even among friendly forces, but it also produced flexibility that proved valuable across countless battlefields. Looking back today, it is easy to focus only on famous tanks, aircraft, or dramatic battles. Yet history often hides inside the smallest details. A faded white stripe. A painted rectangle. A tiny playing card symbol on the side of a steel helmet. To the soldier wearing it, the mark might simply help him find his squad leader. To a German intelligence officer studying captured equipment, it appeared to be a puzzle worthy of careful investigation. Both perspectives were completely understandable. That is what makes this story so fascinating. It reminds us that wars are not fought only with bullets and bombs. They are also fought with observation, interpretation, and countless decisions made under enormous pressure. Every object on a battlefield can tell a story, but not every story has the ending the observer expects. The German officers who gathered around those captured helmets in the summer of 1944 believed they were looking at the key to unlocking an American secret. Weeks later, they understood something far more important. The real strength of the American Army could not be reduced to a painted symbol or a carefully measured stripe. Its greatest advantage was its ability to adapt faster than the enemy expected. Long after the guns fell silent across Europe, many of those battered helmets found their way into museums, private collections, and family homes. Visitors often notice the scratches first. Then they see the faded paint, barely visible after decades. Some wonder why the markings were placed there at all. The answer reaches far beyond simple identification. Those marks captured a moment in history when ordinary soldiers, young officers, and experienced commanders were constantly learning how to survive one of the largest wars the world had ever seen. So the next time you see an American helmet from the Second World War, with a faded stripe, a white bar, or a small painted symbol, remember that German officers once studied those same marks with intense curiosity. They expected to find a hidden code. Instead, they discovered something much harder to defeat: an army that refused to stand still, an army that learned from every battle, and an army whose greatest weapon was not the paint on its helmets, but the people who wore them.